And the first one on the list is Rosemary Krimbel of Chicago. Rosemary.
All right, while Karen's getting the PowerPoint up, let me just start by saying that in Chicago, we had an extraordinarily unique opportunity, something that does not happen very often. We had a mayor who had been there for 24 years and an administration that had not changed for over 20 years when it came to the taxi industry. And last year, we got not just a brand new mayor, Mayor Rahm Emanuel, but a very dynamic, intelligent, smart, impatient, but fast and interesting mayor. The other thing that made Chicago very, very unique is that they had myself and my deputy Rupel. We had been litigating, again, we were both lawyers, had been litigating and involved in taxi regulation for 14 years each. We knew how the business worked. We knew how that 25-year-old ordinance had caused lots of bad incentives and lots of problems. We also both had data backgrounds. I used to be a CEO of an IT corporation. And Rupel used to do all the data crunching for all of the data that we had collected in the past administration. And I have a business background. I've owned several businesses, sold them, and 2/3 of my life has been spent in the private sector, so I understood the business language and I understood incentives and what would make things, I think, work. We explained all of this to the mayor when he came in. He gave us 3 consultants. He gave us a finance guy, an environmental guy, and then just a 3rd consultant who kept us all on task. We rescinded the entire taxi ordinance in Chicago and replaced it with a brand new one, and we did it in about less than 6 months. So let me start with who and what we are. The department that I head is the Department of Business Affairs and Consumer Protection. Its job is to ensure public vehicles that are safe, reliable, and provide Chicagoans and visitors, since taxis are the ambassadors, and Chicago's a world-class city. We have millions of people from all over the world visiting Chicago, and we wanted our taxis to be good ambassadors and not turn people off within a half an hour of walking out of O'Hare. We license nearly 10,000 public vehicles. That's 6,800 taxis, 16,000 chauffeurs. We also do transfers. We issue new ones. We revoke medallions. We do 19,500 vehicle inspections annually. Twice a year, every single vehicle has to come in, goes up on a lift and is totally inspected. And we track 12,000 consumer complaints yearly. So that's where we were and where we are. And what we did is we tried in our new ordinance to change the incentives. We set out our goal. Our goal was to modernize the fleet. The old ordinance, the incentives were to buy used vehicles from New York City after they'd been in service for 3 years, because you could put a car into service in Chicago with 150,000 miles on it, no matter what year it was. We lowered that and changed it. We also changed the incentives so that we could increase the number of fuel-efficient and wheelchair-accessible vehicles. The old ordinance had an incentive that gave you a longer period of time to be on the road if you were a long wheelbase Ford Crown Victoria 8-cylinder, which basically a police interceptor. We changed those incentives. The other goal that we had was protections for the drivers and safety for the passengers and pedestrians. So we standardized leases. We created a driver bill of rights, and we mandated a partnership with industry. We went from lease caps of $59 a day, which were abused across the board because people kept adding things on and getting around them. And we changed the incentives so that if you put on a Prius hybrid or a CNG cab, you got a higher lease rate as a company. So you made more money if you put on a cleaner or greener vehicle. And the cab drivers made more money because on average, they're spending $40 a day on gasoline. I'm sorry, they were spending more than that on gasoline. They were saving $40 a day on gasoline. So they could pay $25 more for a Prius and still pocket $15 more a day. The other thing, which was a big goal for us, was accessibility. We wanted to go as accessible as we could. The fee for a license in Chicago had been $500 a year for 20 years. We changed it to $600 a year, unless you put on a wheelchair car. But more than that, we took that $100 and we put it into a fund. So every year we would have $600,000 in a wheelchair fund to be used to help people who wanted to put a wheelchair vehicle on. So instead of buying a $25,000 Scion, they could buy a $45,000 purpose-built wheelchair accessible vehicle, and the fund would pay the $20,000 difference. And it wouldn't cost the city anything because industry was funding it. That fund caused us to get matching federal funds of $1.77 million. Our wheelchair accessible fund now is $2.2 million for 2013, and it will continue every year. Hopefully we'll go through that. That should put on about another 100 wheelchair accessible cabs. We'll also be changing to a 2-year. I don't think that matters, but licensing is an issue, and instead of doing it every single year, which we normally do, we went to a 2-year. Now, in order to keep things accessible, we need to not only give incentives to the companies to put on wheelchair accessible cars, but we also had to give incentives to the drivers to drive them. So one of the things in our new ordinance, we give away 1 medallion a year in the city of Chicago, free of cost, to drivers who serve the disabled community. Right now we are running that competition. We have 5 drivers who are now been nominated and have nominations coming from Access Living, from our Mayor's Office of People with Disability, from Easter Seals, from the Lighthouse, a number of organizations, and one chauffeur will get 1 medallion worth $350,000 free. And then presumably he'll use that to continue driving a wheelchair accessible car. So now we've married the incentives to put more wheelchair on, and we've also married the incentive to get drivers to drive them. So, this is just the incentives that we put on before. We were lowering now. We had to phase it in. Bit of a negotiation, but we phased it in. We didn't want to shock the industry too much. But down to 75,000 miles, you can still put a used car on, but you shouldn't be able to put on an old cab. But the really big change is this bottom part. The number of years the car can be in service. When I came in as commissioner, cars had been in service. I had cars that were 7, 8, 9 years in service. The reason was extensions. We used to give people a 1-year extension when they needed it. There were many, many reasons. And the department in the old ordinance had the discretion to grant extensions. In the new ordinance, I have no discretion to grant an extension. It is 4 years, period, end of conversation, unless 5 years if it's wheelchair accessible or alternative fuel. That means a 20% increase or 25% increase in your return on investment. You go from 4 years to return it to 5 years. If it's both a wheelchair accessible and alternative fuel, you'll get 6 years. Or your return on investment goes up 50%. Personally, looking at it as a business perspective, we cannot understand why anybody would put on anything other than a wheelchair accessible alternative fuel car. So we passed this ordinance in January of 2012, this year. It truly doesn't take effect until next year. The date was July 1st of this year when it became law. Since then, the number of alternative fuel vehicles, despite all efforts in the past, skyrocketed 400%. And next year, a quarter of the fleet will change out. So I expect to see those numbers go up. The same thing with wheelchair accessible. Despite years of trying, we could never get it over 100. We now have 175. And next year I have $2.2 million to share with industry. And they'll get 6 years if they put on a wheelchair accessible that's fuel efficient. And I'll pay the difference out of that $2.2 million. So we expect in 2013 for the numbers to skyrocket even more. Now the thing I point out here is we didn't mandate anything. We didn't say you must do this or you must do that. We just made it obvious that you'd be an idiot if you didn't, because the money is on the table. Now we did a lot of things, so I'm only giving you highlights here. We changed the placard. This placard is now, I think it's 8.5 by 14. It used to be 11 by 17, but the actual font is larger and the organization is simpler. And we spent a lot of time trying to figure out what color. We tried various colors. We held them underneath a table to see what they look like in the dark, because that's where you're mostly reading taxi placard, and various ways. And this was our final. And that's in all of the cars now. But it is to give the passenger a sort of clear information. And one of the things we paid a lot of attention to is the wording. The old placard used to say, your cab number is. Well, why would you care? This now says, note your cab number. Okay, it's just a change of wording, but it says so much more. Because as we all know who do taxi regulation, nobody knows the number of their cab. Nobody does. They call up, they complain. What's your cab number? I don't know. Okay. So we're hoping this will make a difference. We also were very concerned about drivers, fairness. We had 23, or we still have 23 affiliations. Each one used a different type of lease. Our investigators and enforcement division had a very difficult time trying to enforce because they were written differently, the numbers were in different places. Were they exceeding the cap or not? We couldn't tell. Now we have a uniform lease. Any number that's not on here, or anything that's on here is uniform, and my investigators can look, they know exactly where to go, and the numbers better not beat the cap. So it makes it cleaner and easier for enforcement. And then the last thing that I want to talk about, when I came in as commissioner, which was in May of 2011, in August we had 2 pedestrian deaths. And that really was upsetting. And what was more upsetting was it was apparently my fault. I didn't really understand that because I didn't lease the car to those drivers, and I didn't have anything to do with that accident. However, I do license 16,000 drivers. The new ordinance shares the responsibility. I will give the cab companies, and in fact, we now post it live up on our website, all the data about all the drivers. You want to know how many tickets they got? It's right there. You want to know how many red lights they've ran? It's right there. You find yourself a driver and you lease to him and he's got a bad background, you'll know about it because we will post it. And again, all of that is going to be in real time. And the other thing we did put in, and this was, well, we had 2 controversial things. One was the number of hours. Under the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Act, you can't drive a vehicle for more than 10 hours at a time. And yet we had cabbies who were driving 15, 16-hour days. And one of the things we saw contributing to the accident rate was the length of time behind the wheel. So having collected as much data as we could, though again, the data was somewhat limited, but looking at it across the country, it did appear that the amount of time behind the wheel did make a difference. So they are now limited to 10 hours behind the wheel with a 12-hour lease. And then if you, as a company, give a 24-hour lease to someone, you as the company must put a policy in to assure that the driver doesn't drive it more than 10 hours a day without a rest period in between of 8 hours. So those are some of the things that we did in Chicago. This is where you can see all of our notices and our information. It's all up there. The ordinance, the rules and regs underneath it. This last address here is a central mailbox. It sends out notices, weekly, sometimes daily, in order to distribute the cabs as best we can. Every Thursday and Friday, a list gets blasted out to everybody who signs up, and all the affiliations have, and the number of the cab drivers have. Tells you what events are where. Navy Pier's got a big event. McCormick Place has got this convention. They're going to need cabs between 10 and 11:30 at the Civic Opera House. All that we blast out every week so that the cab drivers themselves and then the companies can post them to the cab drivers who don't have access. But it's our conduit to get information to everyone. We did a lot more, but this is just the highlights. So thank you.
Thank you, Rosemary. I hope you are writing down the questions you have. I'm going to ask you to hold them until all the presenters have completed, and then we're going to open it up for the questions. But so you don't forget what you wanted to ask, please write them down. There was one thing I had meant to tell you about that we did here. For years and years, the Commission struggled in the appropriation process of the District of Columbia to squeeze out a minimal amount of funds to run the Commission. As of the beginning of our fiscal year, October 1st, 2013, we no longer receive any funds from the general taxation funds of the District of Columbia. We are an entirely user-based support organization, and that will, our revenue generally will come from 50-cent surcharge on each ride that our 6,500 cabs and hopefully 1,000 sedan and limousines will be making approximately 30 million rides a year. I'll let you figure out what our revenue will be. We add on top of that our fees that we charge for renewals, new licenses, and other things that we can figure out what we can charge them for. But we are no longer going to have to turn to the general government for the funding we need to get done what we want to do. And we're going to start following some of these other bigger cities and do the same things they've done.